Julian watched his wife, Amelia, snap the two chrome locks on her suitcase shut. The sound was like a pair of gunshots in the cathedral-like silence of their master bedroom. An hour. It had been exactly 1 hour since he had sat her down on their pristine white sofa, the one her mother had insisted upon, and delivered the news. He had held her hand, his own steady, and told her that a devastating letter had arrived. The IRS had flagged a decade of his architectural firm's earnings for a forensic audit. All their assets, personal and professional, were frozen, indefinitely. Her first reaction had been a sharp, bird-like cry of disbelief. Her second, a torrent of accusations. How could he have been so careless, so stupid? Hadn't her father warned her that Julian was too much of a dreamer, not enough of a businessman? Her third reaction, the one that truly mattered, was this: a silent, efficient retreat to the bedroom, the pulling of a designer suitcase from the top of the walk-in closet, and the methodical selection of clothes, shoes, and toiletries. She wasn't packing for a weekend trip. She was packing for an escape. He stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame, a posture of casual observation that belied the tectonic shift happening inside him. He felt no rage, no searing betrayal. Instead, a cold, sharp clarity settled over him, like ice forming on a perfectly still lake. For 5 years of marriage, he had lived in a fog of ambiguity, constantly questioning whether Amelia's affection was genuine or merely an appreciation for the comfortable life he provided. He had wondered if she saw him, Julian the man, or just Julian the provider. Now he had his answer. Her first move wasn't to comfort him, to ask how they would fight this, to say, "We're in this together." Her first move was to pack a bag. She thought he was ruined. She thought the foundation of their life had crumbled. She didn't know he was the architect of that foundation, the man who had designed and built the very ground she stood on. And he was about to prove that he could just as easily demolish it. It's a terrible thing to have to test the person you love, but sometimes it's the only way to know if the structure is sound. What would you do in that moment? How would you feel watching the person who vowed to stand by you through sickness and health, through rich and poor, decide that poor was a deal breaker? Let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's go back. Let's see how the cracks in this beautiful facade first began to appear. It started subtly, as these things often do. The first tremor was at a dinner party, 6 months into their marriage. It was held at the sprawling, ostentatious home of her parents, Eleanor and Richard Vance. Richard was a man who wore his success like a suit of armor, a self-made textiles magnate who believed his wealth granted him a universal wisdom. Eleanor was the curator of their family's image, a woman for whom appearance was not just everything, it was the only thing. Julian, an architect whose work was celebrated for its understated elegance and quiet genius, had always been an odd fit in their world of loud pronouncements and gilded surfaces. That night, the conversation at the dinner table turned to business. Richard was holding court, booming about a recent acquisition. "It's all about leverage, you see," Richard declared, swirling a blood-red Bordeaux in his glass. He then turned his gaze on Julian, a glint of patronizing amusement in his eyes. "You're an artist, Julian. You build beautiful things. But in the real world, it's not about what you build. It's about what you control." He gestured around the table at his guests, a collection of bankers and developers. "We move money. You move concrete." A ripple of polite laughter went around the table. Julian felt Amelia's hand tense slightly on his thigh beneath the tablecloth. He knew she was embarrassed, but he also knew she wouldn't say anything. Defending him would mean contradicting her father, a cardinal sin in the Vance family doctrine. Julian simply smiled, a calm, measured expression he had perfected over the years. "There's a certain permanence to concrete, Richard," he replied, his voice even. "Money is a tide. It comes in, it goes out. A well-designed building stands for a century. It becomes part of the landscape, part of people's lives. I find a great deal of power in that." Richard chuckled, dismissing the sentiment with a wave of his hand. "A romantic notion. Quaint. But it doesn't pay for a house like this, does it?" He winked at Amelia. "Good thing my daughter found a man with taste, and I can foot the bill for it." Another round of laughter, this one louder. Julian looked at Amelia. Her face was flushed, her eyes fixed on her plate. She gave a small, tight smile, a silent concession to her father's barb. She didn't defend him. She didn't have to launch a counterattack. Just a simple, "Father, Julian does very well for himself," would have been enough. But the words never came. In her silence, Julian felt the first hairline crack form in the foundation of his marriage. He saw that in this family, he was not a partner to their daughter. He was an accessory she had acquired, one they felt was slightly below the quality they were accustomed to. He ate his dinner, participated in the conversation, and was the very picture of a gracious son-in-law. But he noted the crack. An architect always pays attention to structural weaknesses. He knew that if left unaddressed, they only ever get worse. And he was right. The second significant tremor occurred nearly a year later, and this time the conflict was not with her family, but directly with Amelia. It was a conflict born from the one thing Julian considered his undisputed domain: design. They were living in a house Julian had designed himself, a modernist structure of glass, steel, and warm cedar that seemed to float above the hillside it was built on. It was his masterpiece, a home he'd poured his soul into long before he met Amelia, a tangible manifestation of his philosophy. He had proposed a small renovation to the master bathroom, a project to incorporate a new type of Italian marble he had sourced, one that captured the morning light in a particularly beautiful way. He had the drawings laid out on the large oak table in his home study, elegant sketches showing how the new stone would integrate with the existing design, enhancing the flow and the feeling of sanctuary. Amelia came in, holding a tablet. "Darling, I was just on the phone with Mother." She never looked at his drawings. She had the most brilliant idea for the bathroom. She swiped through a gallery of images on her screen. They were photos of a bathroom from a celebrity mansion, a gaudy, overwrought space dripping with gold fixtures, black lacquer, and a brand of aggressive opulence that was the antithesis of everything Julian's work stood for. It was a bathroom designed to be photographed, not lived in. "Isn't it fabulous?" Amelia asked, her eyes shining with borrowed enthusiasm. "Mother says this is the look everyone wants now. It's so rich." Julian felt a familiar weariness settle upon him. He took a slow breath, trying to keep the frustration from his voice. "Amelia, this is not the architectural language of this house. It would be like shouting in a library. My design is about tranquility, about the interplay of light and natural materials. This is jarring." She frowned, her brow furrowing in a way that signaled she was about to dismiss his opinion. "Oh, Julian, don't be so pretentious. It's just a bathroom. And it's so much more glamorous than that boring white marble you were talking about." "It's not boring white marble," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's Calicata Borghini. It has a history, a character, and more importantly, it belongs in this house. This," he gestured to her tablet, "belongs in a Las Vegas hotel." This was his field. He was not just an architect, he was an award-winning architect. His name was whispered with reverence in the right circles. But in his own home, his expertise was being waved away in favor of his mother-in-law's fleeting, trend-chasing whim. "Well, I like it," Amelia said petulantly. The final, devastating blow came next. "And besides, it's my father's money that's paying for the renovation, so I think I should get the final say." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and toxic. My father's money. It was a line she had never crossed before, a clear demarcation. Your talent, my family's wealth. You are the artist, we are the patrons. In that moment, he wasn't her husband, her partner. He was a glorified contractor working in a house her father was paying for. The dramatic irony was so thick he could taste it. He was the one who had funded the Shell Corporation that had anonymously acquired a majority stake in Richard's booming textiles company 3 years prior, saving it from a quiet collapse due to Richard's reckless over-leveraging. The quarterly dividends from that company, which Richard believed were the fruits of his own genius, were funneled through a series of trusts directly into an account that Julian alone controlled. The money Amelia was claiming as her father's birthright was, in fact, Julian's. The house they were standing in had been paid for in cash from his own personal wealth long before he'd even met her. Her father wasn't footing the bill for anything. He was, unknowingly, on Julian's payroll. Julian looked at her, at the defiant set of her jaw, and he felt a profound sadness. She had no idea. She was wielding a sword he had forged and handed to her father. "All right, Amelia," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "If that's what you want." He calmly rolled up his drawings and put them away. He would not argue. He would not reveal his secret. Not yet. But the second crack had appeared, wider and deeper than the first. It was no longer just about her family's perception of him. It was about hers. She saw him as a dependent, a kept man with a quaint, artistic hobby. He knew then that a conversation would never be enough to fix this. The foundation was compromised. He would have to test it, to shake it to its very core, to see if there was anything left worth saving. The final public humiliation came on a crisp autumn evening. The event was the 40th wedding anniversary of Eleanor and Richard, a lavish affair held at their exclusive country club. The ballroom was a sea of black ties and glittering gowns, a carefully curated audience for the Vances to display their legacy. Julian, as always, felt like a foreign dignitary from a much quieter, less ostentatious country. He had just returned from a trip to Japan, where his firm had broken ground on a new museum, a project that had been lauded on the cover of a global architecture journal as a paradigm-shifting work of minimalist art. He had told Amelia about it, but the news seemed to slide past her, less interesting than the seating chart for her parents' party. The night wore on, a blur of champagne, air kisses, and conversations about stock portfolios and summering in the Hamptons. Julian was polite, detached, an observer cataloging the social rituals of a tribe he had married into but would never truly belong to. Then came the speeches. Richard, florid and expansive after several glasses of vintage champagne, took the microphone. He spoke of his love for Eleanor, his pride in his business, and his joy in his family. Finally, he turned his attention to his daughter. "And to my beautiful Amelia," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have always been my princess, and I am so glad you found a man who appreciates you." He paused, scanning the crowd for Julian, a smirk playing on his lips. "Julian is a talented fellow, very artistic. He draws lovely pictures of buildings. We're all very proud of the hobby he has turned into a career. He certainly married well." The room erupted in laughter. It wasn't malicious, not entirely. It was the easy, condescending laughter of people who believed themselves to be in on a joke. The joke was Julian, the quiet, serious artist who had somehow lucked into their world of real power and real money. Julian stood beside Amelia, a champagne flute in his hand. He didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply took a slow sip, the bubbles fizzing on his tongue. He could feel the heat radiating from Amelia's body, the burning shame. He glanced at her. She was staring straight ahead, her jaw clenched, a plastic smile plastered on her face. Once again, she said nothing. She endured the joke at her husband's expense, her silence a shield for her own comfort and a betrayal of their partnership. It was in that moment, under the warm glow of the crystal chandeliers, surrounded by the scent of expensive perfume and the sound of self-congratulatory laughter, that Julian's patience finally fractured. It wasn't anger that he felt. It was a sense of profound, liberating finality. He had given them every chance to see him, to respect him. He had quietly propped up their entire world, asking for nothing in return but to be treated as an equal. They had failed spectacularly and publicly. The test he had been contemplating was no longer a hypothetical. It was a necessity. This structure, this marriage, this family connection had to be submitted to a stress test. He needed to see what would happen when the gilded props were kicked out from under it. Later that night, as they drove home in a silence that was heavier than any argument, Julian made a decision. Amelia was scrolling through photos from the party on her phone, already curating the public version of the evening. He pulled his own phone out. He didn't look at photos. He opened a secure messaging app and typed a single, encrypted message to a contact saved under the simple name David. David Chen was not just Julian's financial advisor. He was the shrewd, fiercely loyal architect of Julian's hidden financial empire. The message was brief. David, it's time. I need you to draw up the framework for the Tempest protocol we discussed. Execute in 1 week. He hit send. There was no going back. The quiet man had decided to make a noise. Not a loud, boorish noise like Richard Vance, but the quiet, terrifying rumble of a controlled demolition. He was going to take away the one thing they truly valued, the money, to see if there was anything else of value left underneath. The week that followed was for Julian one of quiet, focused intensity. To the outside world, and especially to Amelia, nothing had changed. He went to his office, he took her calls, he discussed dinner plans. But beneath the surface of this placid routine, he was preparing for a storm of his own making. His office was not the small boutique studio Amelia imagined. She had visited once, years ago, and he had shown her a modest, sunlit space where a few young architects worked diligently at their drafting tables. That was the showroom. His real office was 3 floors above, accessible by a private elevator that required his thumbprint. It was a sprawling, minimalist expanse of concrete and glass overlooking the city, the nerve center of a firm with projects on 4 continents. Here, he wasn't just Julian the artist. He was Mr. Croft, the enigmatic founder and principal of Elysian Fields Architecture, a name that was a quiet joke to him, a nod to the paradise he had built, hidden in plain sight. In this sanctuary, he began the meticulous process of creating the lie that would reveal the truth. He didn't just write a fake letter. He constructed a fiction with the same precision he would use to design a skyscraper. He logged into a system David had created for him, a digital sandbox that could replicate official documents from almost any government agency in the world. He chose the letterhead of the Internal Revenue Service, Department of Enforcement. He studied dozens of real IRS notices, learning their specific bureaucratic vernacular, their cadence of passive-aggressive authority. He drafted the letter, referencing non-existent case numbers and obscure tax codes. He wrote of significant discrepancies in reported foreign income streams and potential structuring violations, phrases that sounded terrifyingly official. He fabricated the name of a senior enforcement agent, Marcus Thorne, and even created a digital signature for him. He printed the letter on high-grade linen paper, the exact kind the government used for its most serious correspondence. He then created a matching envelope, complete with a postmark from the IRS Processing Center in Fresno. It was a perfect forgery, a work of art in its own right. He placed the letter and a few other dummy documents, equally convincing facsimiles of bank seizure notices, into a simple manila envelope. He held it in his hands. It felt weightless, yet it contained the mass of his entire marriage. This envelope was the symbolic object, the detonator for the charge he had set at the base of his life. Touching it, he felt a strange calm. This wasn't an act of revenge, it was an act of diagnosis. He was a doctor about to administer a painful but necessary test to see if the patient could be saved. In the middle of this meticulous preparation, his phone buzzed. It was Amelia. He answered, his voice perfectly normal. "Hi, honey." "Julian, thank God. Listen, I'm at Neiman's, and they have the most divine Chanel jacket, the one I showed you from the runway. It's an absolute fortune, but it's the last one in my size. Can I?" The dramatic irony was a physical force pressing in on him. Here he was holding a document that declared their complete financial ruin, and she was asking to spend $10,000 on a jacket. The disconnect was staggering. She was living in a world of gilded surfaces, utterly unaware of the solid, invisible bedrock beneath her feet that he had provided, and that he was now threatening to remove. "Of course," he said, his voice a mask of placid generosity. "Buy it. Get the matching bag if they have it." "Oh, darling, really? You're the best. I love you," she chirped. "I know," he said softly, and ended the call. He looked down at the envelope in his hands. The words, "I love you," had sounded so easy, so transactional. He wondered what they would sound like in a week, when she believed the Chanel jackets were gone forever. He wondered if he would ever hear them again. He spent the rest of the afternoon with David, going over the final details of the Tempest protocol. It was a multi-layered contingency plan. Phase 1 was the faked asset freeze. Phase 2, if necessary, was the reveal of Julian's true financial standing. Phase 3, the final and most devastating, was the revelation of his ownership of the Vance family's company. "Are you sure about this, Julian?" David asked, his sharp eyes filled with concern. David was more than an employee. He was a friend, the only person who knew the full story. "Once you ring this bell, you can't unring it. This will change everything, no matter the outcome." "I know," Julian said, his gaze fixed on the city skyline. "But I can't live in a house with a cracked foundation, David. I'm an architect. It's against my nature. I have to know what it's made of. It's better to have a beautiful ruin than a beautiful lie." David nodded slowly, understanding. "The accounts are partitioned. Your personal fortune is firewalled from the shared assets and the Vance holdings. When you give the word, I can make it look like everything connected to you and Amelia has gone to zero. The illusion will be perfect. It will hold up against any inquiry she or her father can make." "Good," Julian said. He picked up the manila envelope. The quiet before the storm was over. It was time to make it rain. He left his real office, took the private elevator down to the public-facing studio, and walked out into the world Amelia thought he inhabited, a world of simple drawings and modest means. He was going home to set his house on fire, just to see if his wife would run out or run in. The chosen evening was a Tuesday. The ordinariness of it was part of the design. Catastrophe rarely arrives with a drum roll. It slips in on a Tuesday, between taking out the recycling and deciding what to watch on television. Amelia had come home an hour earlier, flushed with excitement from a charity luncheon. The new Chanel jacket was draped over a chair in the living room, a silent testament to her oblivious bliss. Julian waited until she had poured them both a glass of wine. He waited until she was settled on the white sofa, scrolling through her phone, a picture of contented domesticity. The quiet in the house was a fragile skin stretched over a boiling pot. He walked over to the kitchen island where he had left the manila envelope. He picked it up and came to sit beside her, not too close, creating a small, deliberate space between them. "Amelia," he began, his voice low and grave. She looked up, her smile fading as she registered the seriousness in his tone and the official-looking envelope in his hand. "What is it, Julian? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something came today," he said, sliding the thick envelope onto the marble coffee table between them. "From the IRS." Her eyes widened. The IRS. The three letters that could chill the warmest room. "The IRS? What do they want? Is it about the charity donations?" "It's more serious than that." He didn't open the envelope. He let it sit there, a malevolent presence. "They're claiming there are major issues with my firm's income reporting for the last 10 years, specifically with foreign accounts." "Foreign accounts?" she asked, her voice rising in panic. "What foreign accounts? I didn't know you had foreign accounts. They're part of the business, Amelia. It's complex. He was deliberately vague. The point is, they've initiated a full forensic audit, and they've frozen everything pending the investigation. Every account, the business, our personal checking, the savings, the credit cards, everything. He delivered the last word with a quiet finality. He watched her face as the meaning of the words sank in. He saw the sequence of emotions he had predicted. First, disbelief. Her eyes darted from his face to the envelope and back again. Frozen? What do you mean, frozen? You can't be serious. I am, he said, his expression a mask of grim resignation. Then the disbelief curdled into panic. Her breathing became shallow. Her carefully constructed world, with its luncheons and Chanel jackets, was dissolving before her eyes. Everything? Julian, my card was declined this afternoon at the florist. I thought it was a mistake. So, there's no money? At all? The accounts have a zero balance, he lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. They've seized it all. And then came the third stage, anger. But the anger wasn't directed at the faceless government agency. It was directed squarely at him. How could you let this happen? She hissed, her face a mask of fury. How could you be so incompetent? My father said this would happen. He said you were a careless artist, not a businessman. He said you'd drag me down with you. She stood up, pacing the room like a caged animal. My God, Julian, what are we going to do? What am I going to do? I have the gala on Friday. My dress is being altered. How am I supposed to? She trailed off, the sheer absurdity of her concern hanging in the air. He said nothing. He just watched her, his heart turning into a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He had hoped for a different reaction. A foolish, romantic part of him had hoped she would come to him, take his hand and say, "It's okay, we'll figure it out. I'm here." But she didn't. She didn't move toward him. She moved away. Her eyes, filled with panic and blame, landed on the new jacket. Her perfect life was already a relic of a past she could no longer afford. She pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. I have to call my mother. He nodded slowly. Of course you do. He listened to her side of the conversation, a frantic, one-sided narrative of his failure. Mother? It's a disaster. Julian has ruined us. The IRS. Everything's gone. I don't know what to do. Yes, completely frozen. He just sat there and told me. No, of course he doesn't have a plan. She hung up the phone, her face pale. My parents are on their way over. She looked at him, her eyes cold and distant, as if he were a stranger who had brought a plague into her home. They'll know what to do. Then she turned without another word and walked towards the bedroom. He heard the closet door slide open. He heard the telltale scrape of a suitcase being dragged across the floor. The sound he had been waiting for. The sound that would tell him everything he needed to know. The tension in the room was absolute. He sat perfectly still on the sofa, a statue in the ruins of his own making, and waited for the locks on the suitcase to snap shut. The clicks of the locks echoed in the cavernous silence of the living room. 1, 2. Each sound was a punctuation mark at the end of a chapter. The chapter of his marriage he had tried so hard to believe in. Amelia emerged from the bedroom, pulling the sleek, silver suitcase behind her. Its wheels whispered across the polished concrete floors. She was wearing a different outfit now, practical jeans, a cashmere sweater, her most sensible designer sneakers. She was dressed for a strategic retreat. She didn't look at him. She walked towards the front door, her movements precise and determined. She stopped, her hand hovering over the doorknob, and for a fleeting second, Julian thought she might turn, might say something. But she only adjusted the strap of her purse on her shoulder. He had to be sure. He had to hear it. "Where are you going, Amelia?" he asked, his voice calm, almost conversational. She finally turned to face him, and her expression was one of weary exasperation, as if he were a child asking a stupid question. I'm going to my parents' house, obviously. I can't stay here. There's nothing here. I'm here, he said softly. A short, bitter laugh escaped her lips. You? You're the reason there's nothing here, Julian. You're the problem. I need to be with my family. They'll take care of me. There it was, the final confirmation. In her mind, he was no longer family. He was a liability to be shed, a sinking ship to be abandoned. He stood up slowly and walked towards her, stopping a few feet away. He looked at her, then at the suitcase, then back at her face. The mask of the beleaguered husband fell away, replaced by an expression of quiet, profound authority. I remember the dinner party for your father's 65th birthday, he began, his voice even and low. Amelia frowned, confused by the non sequitur. What are you talking about? Your father made a toast, Julian continued, as if she hadn't spoken. He called my life's work a hobby. You were embarrassed, but you smiled and said nothing. I remember that. He took another step closer. I remember when we were planning the bathroom renovation. You dismissed my professional opinion, my life's work, in favor of your mother's vulgar taste. And you told me it was your father's money, so you had the final say. I remember that too. Julian, what is the point of this? She snapped, her hand tightening on the suitcase handle. Dredging all this up now? It's over. We're ruined. And I remember your parents' anniversary party, he went on, his voice a relentless, quiet current. When your father joked to a room full of people that I had married well, and you stood beside me, smiling a perfect plastic smile, and said nothing. You let him diminish me. You let them all diminish me. For 5 years you have stood by and let your family treat me as something less than, as an amusing pet you brought into the house. And you never once, not a single time, defended me. He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the space between them. Her defiance began to falter, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. This was not the broken, defeated man she had been talking to minutes before. I did all of this, he gestured vaguely to the fake letter on the table, because I had to know. I had to know if you married me or if you married a lifestyle. I had to know if you would stand with me or run to your father. And in the space of 1 hour, you have given me the most clear, unambiguous answer I could have ever asked for. Her face was a canvas of warring emotions, shock, guilt, and a dawning, terrifying confusion. You did this on purpose? You lied to me? Yes. Why? She whispered, the word barely audible. Why would you do something so cruel? Cruel? He asked, the word sharp but spoken softly. You think a lie is cruel? I think a 5-year performance of a marriage is cruel. I think standing by while your husband is mocked is cruel. I think abandoning him the moment you believe the money is gone is the definition of cruel. He took a deep breath. This wasn't cruelty, Amelia. It was a diagnostic tool, a stress test for a structure I suspected was fundamentally unsound. And you, my dear, have failed. Spectacularly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He sent a single, one-word text to David. Phase 2. But that isn't the real secret, he said, looking her directly in the eye. The fact that the IRS letter is a fabrication, that's just the appetizer. The main course is about to be served. And I believe your parents have just arrived to join us for dinner. As if on cue, the headlights of a large Mercedes swept across the living room windows. A car door slammed with expensive Teutonic finality. The doorbell chimed, not once, but 3 times in rapid, impatient succession. Amelia looked from Julian to the door, her face a mask of dread. The cavalry had arrived, but she was suddenly no longer sure who the enemy was. Julian simply smiled, a thin, cold smile she had never seen before. Let them in, he said. This is a family meeting after all. Amelia, moving as if in a trance, opened the front door. Eleanor and Richard Vance swept in like a weather system, their faces thunderous with indignation. Richard was a bull, his chest puffed out, ready to charge. Eleanor's face was pinched with disgust, as if she had walked into a slum. "Amelia, darling, are you all right?" Eleanor rushed to her daughter, ignoring Julian completely. Richard, however, marched directly up to Julian, his finger jabbing at the air inches from Julian's face. "You, you incompetent fool! What have you done? I knew it. I told Amelia from day one you didn't have what it takes. You've destroyed my daughter's life." Julian didn't move. He didn't flinch. He simply stood his ground, a pillar of calm in the center of their manufactured storm. He let Richard's tirade wash over him, a torrent of insults about his career, his character, his very manhood. He listened patiently, his eyes never leaving Richard's face. When Richard finally paused to draw a breath, Julian spoke, his voice cutting through the rage with surgical precision. "Are you finished?" he asked quietly. Richard sputtered, taken aback by the lack of fear. "Finished? I haven't even started. You're going to fix this, and you're going to fix it now." Julian's gaze shifted from Richard to Eleanor, who was stroking Amelia's hair, murmuring about how they would get her the best divorce lawyer. Then his eyes settled back on Richard. "Richard," Julian said, his tone shifting from defensive to something else entirely, something analytical, almost predatory. "Let's talk about your business, Vance Textiles. You've had a good decade, remarkable really, especially considering where you were 10 years ago." The change in topic was so abrupt it stopped Richard cold. A flicker of confusion, then unease, crossed his face. "What does that have to do with anything?" 10 years ago, Julian continued, his voice steady and relentless, Vance Textiles was 3 weeks from insolvency. You had over-leveraged on a disastrous expansion into the Asian market. Your creditors were calling in their notes, and you were facing a hostile takeover from a competitor that would have stripped the company for parts. You were going to lose everything, your house, your reputation. Do you remember that, Richard? Richard's face went pale. It was a chapter of his life he had buried, a near-death experience he never spoke of. How do you know about that?" he stammered. "I know because I was there," Julian said. "Not in person, but my money was. Do you remember the 11th hour savior? The anonymous overseas investment group, Helios Capital, that swept in and bought up your debt, recapitalized the company, and installed a new financial controller who somehow managed to turn everything around?" Richard stared at him, his mouth slightly agape. Of course he remembered. He had spun it to the world as his own brilliant maneuvering, a testament to his resilience. "Helios Capital," Julian said, savoring the name. "The Greek god of the sun. I always found that amusing." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air, a guillotine waiting to drop. "Helios Capital is a shell corporation, Richard. A legal fiction. It's one of several that I own." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence so profound that the hum of the refrigerator seemed like a roar. Eleanor's hand froze on Amelia's back. Amelia looked from her father's ashen face to her husband's calm, implacable one. "You're lying," Richard whispered, the words devoid of conviction. "Am I?" Julian replied. He walked over to the coffee table and picked up his phone. "David, are you on your way?" He listened for a moment. "Excellent. 5 minutes." He put the phone down and looked back at the 3 stunned faces. "For 10 years, Richard, you have been running my company. The generous salary you draw, the dividends you believe are the fruits of your labor, the very financial ground you stand on, it all comes from me. You haven't been a CEO. You've been a well-compensated employee. My employee." He then turned his gaze to Amelia. "The money you thought was your father's? The money you so cruelly threw in my face during our argument about the bathroom? That was my money. The allowance you get, the cars you drive, this very house, it has always, all of it, been me." He let the devastating truth settle. "You haven't been supporting your daughter, Richard," Julian said, his voice dropping to an almost gentle register. For the last 5 years, I have been supporting all of you. Your lifestyle, your country club membership, your pride, all of it courtesy of the incompetent fool and his little hobby. The structure of their world didn't just crack, it vaporized. Richard, the great patriarch, the titan of industry, stumbled backward and sank into an armchair, his face the color of wet cement. Eleanor let out a small, strangled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Her carefully maintained mask of aristocratic disdain had shattered, revealing the raw, terrified greed beneath. Amelia stood frozen, trapped between the wreckage of her parents and the terrifying stranger her husband had become. "No," Richard mumbled, shaking his head in a daze. "No, it's not possible. It's a trick, a lie. You couldn't. You're just an architect." "I am an architect," Julian agreed calmly. "I build things, and sometimes I buy things. 10 years ago I bought your company. It was a sound investment." Richard's denial escalated into a sputtering rage. "You're lying. You have no proof. This is insane. You think you can just walk in here and claim everything I built?" He struggled to his feet, his face turning a blotchy red. "I'll call my lawyers. I'll have you ruined for this. Slander, fraud." As if summoned by the word lawyers, the doorbell chimed again. This time it was a calm, single chime. Julian walked to the door and opened it. Standing on the threshold was David Chen, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, holding a slim leather briefcase. He looked like the personification of quiet, lethal competence. "David," Julian said with a nod, "thank you for coming." "Julian," David replied, his eyes sweeping the scene in the living room with a practiced, neutral gaze. He stepped inside. "Who the hell is this?" Richard demanded. "This is David Chen," Julian said, as David placed his briefcase on the large dining room table and clicked it open. "He is my primary financial counsel and the manager of the trust that holds the majority shares of Vance Textiles." David didn't say a word. He simply began to remove documents from his briefcase and lay them out on the polished wood of the table. Each document was placed with the precision of a surgeon laying out his instruments. There were the original share certificates for Vance Textiles, transferred to Helios Capital. There were the incorporation documents for Helios Capital, listing Julian Croft as the sole beneficial owner. There were detailed financial statements tracing the flow of funds from the textile company's profits into the trust, and from the trust into the various accounts that funded the Vance family's life. There were the deed to the house, in Julian's name alone, paid in full 3 years before he had even met Amelia. The car registrations, the country club membership application, with Julian listed as the primary member and Richard as his sponsored guest. It was an irrefutable, paper and ink monument to a decade-long deception. A deception designed not to harm, but to protect an investment. An investment that had now, finally, been called into question. Richard stared at the documents, his blustering rage collapsing into a wheezing gasp. He picked up one of the share certificates, his hand trembling. He saw the signature of his past self, signing away his company to an anonymous entity to save it from ruin. He dropped the paper as if it were burning hot. Julian stood by the table, his arms crossed. This was the moral mirror, the moment he forced them to see themselves not as they imagined, but as they truly were. "For 10 years, Julian said, his voice resonating with cold, hard clarity, "you have lived a lie. You have built your entire identity on a foundation of my success, all while looking down on me, mocking my work, and insulting my character in my own home. You drank my wine, ate my food, lived under my roof, and called me an incompetent fool. You took my generosity and mistook it for weakness. You took my silence and mistook it for stupidity." He looked at Eleanor, whose face had crumpled into a mask of pure horror. "You worried about appearances, Eleanor. Well, how does this appearance suit you? The matriarch of a family living on the charity of the son-in-law you so openly despised. Then he looked at Richard, who had sunk back into the chair, a broken man. And you, Richard, you talked about power and control, but you never had any. You were a figurehead, a puppet dancing on strings you couldn't even see. The arrogance that had defined them was gone, stripped away to reveal the pathetic, desperate core. It was Richard who broke the silence, his voice a ragged plea. Julian, son, please, you can't do this. The company, our friends, our reputation, it will be the end of us. Eleanor, too, found her voice, a high, reedy whine. He's right, Julian. Think of Amelia. You can't humiliate her like this. We can fix this. We'll be better. We promise. Just don't take it all away. Their pleas were not for their daughter's marriage. They were for their status, their money, their place in the world. In their moment of utter ruin, their first instinct was still to save themselves. And Amelia saw it all. Julian ignored her parents completely. Their desperate pleading was just noise, the final death rattle of their pride. His focus was entirely on Amelia. She stood alone in the center of the room, a solitary island in a sea of shattered illusions. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a pain so profound it seemed to steal the air from her lungs. She was looking at her parents, truly looking at them for the first time, not as the infallible titans of her youth, but as they were now, weak, grasping, and utterly selfish. Then she looked at Julian, the man she thought she knew, the man she had been prepared to abandon, now revealed as the silent, unacknowledged center of her entire universe. The suitcase she had packed with such defiant purpose now seemed like a monument to her own folly. It stood by the door, a symbol of a choice she had made based on a complete and catastrophic misunderstanding of her own life. Julian walked towards her, his footsteps the only sound in the room. He stopped in front of her, his expression softening slightly from the cold fury he had shown her parents. The anger was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant sadness. "The life you believed you had is gone, Amelia," he said, his voice quiet, meant only for her. "It was never real. The parents you worshipped, the wealth you took for granted, the husband you dismissed, it was all an illusion, a beautiful, fragile structure built on a lie." He paused, giving her a moment to absorb the enormity of it. "But now, for the first time, you have the chance to build something real. You have a choice to make, and for the first time, it has to be based on reality, not on the script your parents wrote for you." He held her gaze, his own unwavering. "You can stay here with me. We can try to build a real marriage, a real partnership, brick by brick, on a foundation of truth. It will be hard. It will require you to leave them," he gestured to her parents, "and their poison behind. It will require you to find out who you are without their money and their name. Or," he glanced toward the front door, where her suitcase waited, "or you can walk out that door with them. You can choose to cling to the wreckage of their pride. But if you do, you must understand this. You will walk out with nothing. The life they promised to take care of for you is mine to give or to take away. The clothes on your back, the car you drive, the money in the bank account they are about to try and access, it is all mine. If you leave me now, you will leave with nothing, just as you believed you were about to leave me." It was a stark, brutal choice. A choice between an unknown, difficult future built on truth, or a return to a comfortable lie that no longer existed. Eleanor, overhearing this, let out a wail. "Amelia, no! You can't abandon us! We're your family!" Richard, seeing his last hope of influencing the situation, tried to appeal to what he thought was Julian's decency. "Julian, for God's sake, have some mercy. Don't do this to her. Don't make her choose." "She already chose, Richard," Julian said, his voice turning to ice again as he addressed his father-in-law. "She chose when she packed that bag. This is merely her chance to reconsider that decision, now that she has all the facts." The focus of the room narrowed to a single point: Amelia. Her parents stared at her with desperate, pleading eyes, seeing her not as a daughter, but as their last, best negotiating chip. Julian watched her with a calm, patient stillness, offering her a future, but demanding she earn it. She looked at her suitcase. She looked at her weeping mother and her broken father. Then she looked at her husband, the stranger who held her entire world in the palm of his hand. Her decision would not just define her future, it would define her very soul. 6 months later, the rain fell in clean, straight lines against the floor-to-ceiling glass of Julian's office, his real office. The city spread out below him, a glittering tapestry of lights softened by the storm. He wasn't watching the rain. He was looking at a set of architectural plans spread across a vast white table. It was a new design, a community arts center for a low-income neighborhood, a pro bono project his firm had taken on. It was a building about creating foundations for others. The door to his office opened softly. It was Amelia. She was not the same woman from 6 months ago. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by simple, elegant basics. Her face was thinner, and the brittle, defensive hardness in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, searching vulnerability. She carried 2 mugs of tea. She had chosen to stay. That night, after her parents had finally left, escorted out by a silent David, their threats and pleas dissolving into the night, Amelia had stood alone in the living room for a long time. Then, she had walked to the front door, opened it, and rolled her suitcase out onto the porch, leaving it in the rain. She had closed the door and turned to Julian, her face streaked with tears. "I don't know who you are," she had whispered, "and I don't think I know who I am. But I would like to find out, if you'll let me." The path had not been easy. It was a slow, painful excavation of their relationship. Amelia had started therapy. She had cut off contact with her parents, an act that felt like severing a limb. She had taken a job at an art gallery, a real job, one that paid a modest salary she was fiercely proud of. She was learning to stand on her own 2 feet, even though those feet were still, technically, on ground that Julian owned. They were building something new, something tentative and fragile, but something honest. As for Eleanor and Richard, Julian had been true to his principles. He had not been cruel. He had not destroyed them. That would have made him no better than they were. Through David, he had restructured Vance Textiles. Richard was removed as CEO and given a forced retirement. Julian installed a new, competent board to run the company properly. He arranged a small, fixed pension for Eleanor and Richard, drawn from the company's profits, enough for them to live a comfortable, quiet life, but not enough to maintain the illusion of their former status. He had taken away their power, not their livelihood. It was a poetic justice that was, to them, a fate worse than outright ruin. They had lost their audience. Amelia set one of the mugs down on the table beside Julian's hand. "It's looking beautiful," she said, her eyes on the drawings. "It's about creating space for people to find their own voice," he said, looking at her. "Something I think we both understand now." She smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Yes, we do." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the storm. The demolition had been brutal, the cleanup painful. But here, in the aftermath, something new was being built. It was not the grand, perfect palace they had once inhabited. It was smaller, simpler, but its foundation was solid rock. Julian reflected on the immense risk he had taken. He had been prepared to lose everything to find the truth. He had learned that a structure built on a weak or deceptive foundation is not a home. It is a prison waiting to collapse. Sometimes the only way to be free is to be the one to light the fuse, to tear it all down so you can see what, if anything, is left standing in the daylight. He had discovered that true wealth wasn't the numbers in his hidden accounts. It was the integrity to demand honesty. And true strength wasn't the power to control others. It was the dignity to stand your ground, even if you ended up standing alone. Julian chose a difficult path to find the truth, a path that could have ended in solitude. What do you think of his decision? Was his test justified, or was it a betrayal in itself? We'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story compelling, please give it a like and subscribe for more stories that explore the complex foundations of our lives. Until next time, remember that the strongest structures aren't always the most beautiful, but they are always the ones built on the firmest ground.